Welcome to a new history of Old San Antonio. Episode 3, The Canary Islanders. I'm Brandon Seal.
Oh, my city, San Antonio. Tonight I'm looking at your lovely light.
On March 8th, 1731, a band of 56 men, women, and children made camp on the Medina River. They had been traveling now for the better part of a year, having left their homes in the Canary Islands on March 27th, 1730. The Spanish crown had promised to provide them everything they might need for the entire first year of their lives in their new homes here, down to handkerchiefs and socks. And the crown had promised to furnish each family a yoke of oxen, 5 breeding cows and a bull, 5 mares and a stallion, and farming implements, as well as a mill for their community and a proper church for them in the center of their new town. When that still wasn't enough, these hard-trading Canary Islanders finally extracted from the king promises of land, the right to form their own government, and titles of minor nobility to each head of household. Still, 11 months into the journey, it felt like meager recompense for all that they'd had to endure. 4 of their fellow travelers had died along the way, and one had tried to kill himself. They had landed first in Havana, disembarked briefly, then boarded another ship for Veracruz, from which they had moved overland, walking mostly, but a few on burros or draft animals, to Mexico City, San Luis Potosí, Monterrey, Saltillo, and Monclova. Their numbers grew along the way as well, when a few young couples paired off, a child was born, and 2 other Canary Islanders already in New Spain joined them. But the extra bodies didn't make travel any easier or any quicker. As they neared the end of their journey, the Canary Islanders, or Isleños as they were called, couldn't help but feeling that maybe the whole enterprise was just a way for the crown to get rid of them. They had a reputation as being hardy, yet self-important and difficult to govern. In their defense, to get the crown's attention to their needs, they had to be. The Canary Islands lie 1,000 miles southwest of the Iberian Peninsula, in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, closer to Africa than to Europe, and at approximately the same latitude as San Antonio. Originally conquered in the 1400s and colonized by Spaniards who interbred with the indigenous population, the island became a critical way station in the early exploration of the Americas. The island's volcanic soil proved particularly well suited to sugar plantations, and the islands soon created spectacular wealth for the first 2 centuries of Spanish rule. Yet by the 18th century, the soil had played out, and Caribbean sugar plantations worked by slave labor began to outcompete them in almost every respect. The islands were, by the 1700s, overpopulated, and many of the inhabitants descended into poverty. Except for the thin layer of largely absentee nobility, most Isleños lived a hard-scrabble life and were becoming increasingly vocal about it. As early as 1719, the Marquis de Aguayo, the governor of Texas at the time and the founder of Mission San Jose from the previous episode, had advocated settling some 400 Isleño families in San Antonio, an idea further endorsed 5 years later by a royal inspector who had argued for San Antonio to become the principal Spanish settlement on the northern frontier. The Viceroy, the Council of the Indies, and the King himself agreed on the need to firm up their tenuous foothold in Texas. One family is worth 100 soldiers, the conventional wisdom held, in promoting the virtues of civilian and especially Isleño relocation, and so the Crown decided that the best thing to do with these irascible islanders was to ship them off to the New World. Most Isleños, it seems, were less enthusiastic about the idea. Despite earlier goals of recruiting 400 Canary Island families, the Crown was lucky to recruit 10, and these only after the certain enticements discussed earlier were offered. Yet these 10 families, and a few other hangers-on, accepted the offer, and now they had made the journey halfway around the world. They set up camp on March 8, 1731, on the banks of the Medina River, amidst a great and fertile expanse of apparent emptiness. In the daytime, it seemed so full of opportunity. Yet at night, it was more ominous somehow. Most barbarously large and final, as a later writer of the region would call it. What they felt most, however, was excitement at knowing that their new homes lie just over the row of hills before them. This land was not empty, however. It had seen them coming and decided to greet them in fine frontier fashion. That night, as the moon rose and the travelers fell asleep, an Apache war party on their last raid of the spring materialized out of the darkness with horrific cries. The Isleños had never seen anything like these fearsome, mounted Indios Barbaros. Whipping and whooping their way through the camp on their horses, the Apaches stirred the Isleños into a confused panic as they scrambled for their families and their weapons. Dressed in tanned buffalo hides, their hair long and greased and held back with a headband, the Apaches then seemed to disappear as suddenly as they had appeared, along with many of the Isleños' horses and valuables. Once the Apaches rode off, the Isleños took stock of what had happened. No one was killed or seriously injured, but the Isleños were left with a horrible sense of helplessness, and presumably spent a rather sleepless night wondering what they had gotten themselves into. On the morning of March 9th, these 56 Canary Islanders, 15 families and 4 bachelors by now, stumbled into San Antonio de Béjar and were no more inspired by what they saw in the light of day. San Antonio in 1731 was nothing more than a conglomeration of friars, converted Indians, soldiers, and their families. Perhaps the only stone buildings were the Presidio commander's house, a barracks, and a few storerooms at each of the missions. Most of the great buildings wouldn't be started until the next decade. The town had no walls, no government, and no real organization to speak of. The one thing the community had in abundance was land, but most of the best land had already been assigned to the original settlers, who called themselves vecinos, or neighbors, or to the missions, 3 of which had deliberately staked out their lands along the San Antonio River just a few days prior to the Isleños' arrival. The Presidio commander, the de facto royal authority in San Antonio, immediately offered to help, however. He housed them in the Presidio's meager buildings and assigned them lots from those lands reserved for the original settlers. He wanted to keep these new arrivals close, partly in order to protect them, but also in order to build up his economic base in his ongoing coopetition with the nearby missions. The Isleños were all too happy to accept, for several reasons. First, settling near the Presidio soldiers offered them significantly more protection than if they had sought out their own lands further downriver, and protection was at the top of their minds after their first night's encounter with the Apache welcoming party. Second, settling on the original vecinos' town lots meant that they could take advantage of the San Pedro acequia, which the original soldiers and settlers had already dug. And third, recall that the Presidio wasn't a proper fort in the way it's often translated. There was in fact no single building to which Presidio referred. The Presidio referred collectively to all of the soldiers stationed in San Antonio, their buildings around the Plaza de Armas, and their assorted projects and patrols designed to tame the province and make it more suitable for settlement. And all of these things, soldiers, buildings, and patrols, required money and supplies, which meant that the Presidio had a substantial budget. For this reason, it was the primary driver of economic life in San Antonio for the first half-century of its existence, and locals would constantly compete to fill its lucrative supply contracts. The Isleños knew this instinctively and jumped at the opportunity to establish themselves nearby. All of these factors contributed to giving the Isleños a significant head start, and their community soon buzzed with activity. Within a few months, the Isleños had already planted their first crop, and then turned to set about to do what the original vecinos had never had time to form a proper town. In strict accordance with the law of the Indies, the Isleños surveyed and staked out their town around a plaza adjacent to the Presidio's Plaza de Armas. They called it the Plaza de las Islas, the Plaza of the Islands, in honor of their homeland, and the town they called San Fernando, in honor of the reigning Spanish king who had underwritten their journey. On July 2, 1731, they broke ground for San Fernando Cathedral, from whose future dome all distances in San Antonio would be measured. On August 1st, the Presidio commander convened the first meeting of the City Council of San Fernando. This city council, or ayuntamiento, was composed of 5 regidores, or councilmen, and the alcalde, which is often rendered as mayor, though we might do better to call him the county judge, the modern-day Texas descendant of the alcalde's administrative and judicial authority. The 2 Isleños who could read and write were, logically, made county clerk and sheriff respectively, and a non-political municipal tax collector and administrator of the irrigation system, the mayordomo, was appointed as well. The names of these first city fathers, Leal, Curbelo, Travieso, Arrocha, and others, will appear prominently and without interruption throughout our study. Conspicuously absent from this first city council, however, were any of the original vecinos. At first, the vecinos had been content to simply mock the new arrivals for their claims of nobility, their lack of experience with horses, and their unfamiliarity with frontier traditions such as militia service. And though it peeved them when these newcomers had been granted some of the last town lots off of the San Pedro acequia, which they had dug, they had tolerated it in the name of community building. But when this new aristocracy was suddenly granted a right to rule over them without their consent, they bucked. They went straight to the viceroy, bypassing the Presidio commander, whom they increasingly perceived as in cahoots with the Isleños, and demanded the right to be represented on the city council. The viceroy agreed with them, but San Antonio's distance from Mexico City made it an easy order for the Isleños to ignore. San Antonio politics for the next 14 years would be dominated by this conflict between the original vecinos and these new Isleños, and indeed, an etymological war would ensue between the two groups as to who were the real founders of the community. For the first decade, the Isleño faction largely won the political battle, in spite of the fact that they were never more than 20% of the local population. In part, they won out simply because they were so determined to make this new world the place they had been promised it could be. This is why they had formed a town government, and this is why in 1733 they petitioned and were granted rights to essentially all of the San Antonio River's flows not already appropriated to the missions, to free them up for distribution and development. The Isleño City Council went on to impose obligations on all such property holders to improve their land, under penalty of forfeiture, requiring communal care of the acequias, that all arable land be tilled, and that permanent stone structures be constructed to replace the sharihacales that predominated prior to their arrival. The Isleños were the kind of advocates that civilian San Antonio had never known. They were aggressive and effective political players. They complained about the vecinos' livestock wandering into their fields. When they were chastised for injuring those vecinos' loose livestock, they retaliated by stealing mission livestock. When the friars tried to bring a cause of action against the Isleños countersued the friars for refusing to share their supply of cheap Indian labor while monopolizing all the best lands, and eventually began maneuvering to have the missions disbanded entirely. The Isleños' battle with the missions became particularly heated after 1736, when a Canary Islander who shared his compatriots' dislike for the mission fathers took office as governor of Texas and made San Antonio his residence. Governor Franquis de Lugo made no secret of his antipathy toward the friars, whom he called, quote, alcahuetes cornudos cabrones, end quote, which we'll just leave untranslated for the purposes of avoiding an explicit rating on this. The Franciscan friars returned the favor, referring to him as the, quote, spawn of Satan, end quote. Isleño frustration with the missions arose from three sources. The first was that the missions held some of the most fertile lands in the area, and they weren't taking advantage of them. There can be no greater affront to industrious men than to see idle resources going underutilized. Second, the missions had an effective monopoly on supplying the Presidio with food. The Presidio was under orders to buy as much as they could from the missions, since doing so more or less kept precious specie in the crown's coffers. Yet the Presidio Mission Trade Alliance deprived the Isleños of the only legitimate local market for their goods. And third, the missions refused to allow their charges to be hired out by the Isleños. Labor was scarce on the frontier, and the fact that the missions were able to use Indian labor to produce their food only further advantaged them unfairly in the eyes of the Isleños. The friars' position, however, was always well articulated and well defended by their leader during this critical period between 1731 and 1745. Father Benito Fernandez de Santa Anna bore no relation, of course, to that less godly Santa Anna who will come to San Antonio a century later. Born and trained in Spain, Father Fernandez was only 24 years old when he arrived in San Antonio in 1731, and he would eventually rise to the post of president of the Querétaran missions in San Antonio, which he would oversee from his seat at Mission Concepcion. And he never lost sight of his charge to protect the lands that had been assigned to his missions, to protect his market in the Presidio, and to protect his converts from exploitation by less scrupulous men. The Isleño governor Lugo, however, began to stick his thumb on the scales of the Isleño mission battles. He encouraged the Isleños to build a bridge across the horseshoe bend of the San Antonio River, by which they began to turn out their livestock on untilled Valero lands. He pulled the Presidio soldiers stationed at each mission, which led to a drop in numbers and in discipline. And then, just as the missions were already under political attack, a horrific smallpox epidemic hit. The smallpox epidemic of 1738 and 39 killed 655 of the 837 mission Indians in the San Antonio area. That's a staggering number on two counts. One, it's a demonstration of the spectacular success that the San Antonio missions were having in converting natives to the faith. But two, it's staggering because of the magnitude of the devastation. 1/3 of the Indians at San Jose and half of those at Concepcion died. Valero, San Juan, and Espada were almost entirely depopulated. What was a tragedy for the missions, however, was a clear opportunity for the Isleños. In 1739, they sent a delegation to Mexico City to petition for the right to sell produce to the Presidio and to employ mission Indian labor. Father Fernandez, strategically, did not oppose them in 1739. Like many of San Antonio's leaders over the years, he was fundamentally a pragmatist, and he was acutely aware of his vulnerability at this moment. Indeed, his missions were in real danger of being disbanded, depopulated as they were, and the Presidio would have been in danger of starvation that year had he insisted on retaining his prerogative to feed it. And so, the Viceroy assented to the Isleños' demand, but in a roundabout fashion it proved to be a politically masterful act of community building. First, he prohibited the missions from producing more than they could consume. Note that this wasn't quite what the Isleños had wanted. They wanted an exclusive right to supply the Presidio themselves. Instead, the Viceroy had struck down the mission monopoly on supplying the Presidio, but effectively opened it up to all of San Antonio, Isleño and Vecino alike. Thus, in one act, he was able to feed the Presidio, appease the Isleños, and improve the lot of the original Vecinos. Second, the Viceroy allowed for the hiring of mission Indians by locals. As we've seen, however, the missions were virtually depopulated of Indians at this point. So in truth, this concession had no real impact, even as it looked like acquiescence to a long-held Isleño demand. Third, and in direct defiance of other Isleño demands, the Viceroy refused to disband the missions. On the contrary, he reaffirmed their importance to the royal colonial vision and offered them critical support in rebuilding, ensuring that a local counterweight would remain to growing Isleño power. The elegance of the Viceroy's decree of 1739 and its sensitivity to local political dynamics suggests the influence of a local like Father Fernandez. Indeed, it was Father Fernandez who benefited most from the decree of 1739, and it bought him immense political credibility as a fair-minded community leader. He could afford to be gracious to the Isleños for the time being as well, since the political tides were starting to turn against them. By 1741, the Isleños' compatriot Governor Lugo had long since been replaced, and a new governor with little sympathy for the Isleños had taken office. This new governor described them as, quote, more given to prejudice than to progress, end quote. In contrast, he spoke highly of the missions and their charges, which under Father Fernandez's guidance had recovered remarkably quickly in the 2 years since the smallpox epidemic. The new governor was also sympathetic to the original vecinos' long-ignored complaints about the Isleños, chief among them being the Isleños' ongoing refusal to allow vecinos on the city council. By contrast, the Isleños' never-ending grievances finally exasperated whatever sympathies royal authorities had for the hardship of their initial voyage. By the 1740s, one vice-regal official would famously write, quote, these Isleño families complain against the Reverend Fathers, the Presidio captain, and about the established families, so that it seems they want to be left in sole and undisputed possession of the entire province. Perhaps even then they won't find enough room, end quote. In 1744, with the missions fully recovered from the 1738 smallpox epidemic and boasting a meaningful agricultural surplus, the opponents of the Isleños took the opportunity to strike them a blow. On January 4th, 1745, the Viceroy's decree of 1739 was rescinded, and the Mission Presidio trade monopoly was reinstated. The local political dynamic had changed, however, and this time, it wasn't just these Isleños who got fired up. Vecino families had also started to benefit from the Presidio trade. And something else was at work here as well. 14 years of trading together, living together, and, well, sleeping together had blurred the lines between original vecinos and Isleños. Of the 30 marriages recorded in San Fernando Church between 1742 and 1760, only 5 would be pure Isleño marriages. Even the faction of Isleños, which had originally opposed any sort of intermixing with the original settlers, had in fact become the most active at intermarrying with the most prosperous old settlers, and particularly with the presidial officer class, who joined their voices to the protest of the rescission of the 1739 decree. Compadrazgo, intermarriage, and the propensity of elites to absorb up-and-comers had, by 1745, created a more blended society in San Antonio. Proximity almost always trumps prejudice. Even the Isleños began to call themselves vecinos. To be sure, the Isleños held on to their traditions, and to their identity, of course, and do so even to this day in the Canary Islanders Descendants Association. And there would always be an advantage to be had in San Antonio society by being able to claim Isleño descent. Canary Islander would always have a faint ring of nobility to it, and a distinct ring of Spanish pure-bloodedness, even as the royal authorities and proper Spaniards would only ever look down on them as provincial and backward. By 1745, it was clear to San Antonio's various communities that none of them were going to go away. The missions declared their permanence in the magnificent buildings they began to erect. The Presidio continued to be the center of economic life and de facto governor of the province. The original settlers would embrace their frontier identity and pass their fierce independence and self-reliance into the local bloodlines. And the Isleño City Council and its political control over the community was an accepted fact of life. The rescission of the Viceroy's 1739 decree, then, actually provoked a grand civic compromise between the various groups, brokered by Father Fernandez using the political capital he had won in 1739, and guaranteed by the Presidio commander, Toribio de Urrutia. Toribio de Urrutia had unique credibility at this moment as well, not only because he was the son of José de Urrutia, that Spanish leatherstocking from previous episodes and the most famous Indian fighter of the last 50 years, but also because he had just fended off another horrific Apache attack on June 30th, 1745, an attack which might very well have wiped the settlement entirely off the map, had not a boy from town discovered the ambushing Apaches and alerted Mission Indians from Valero, who took up arms and came to the rescue of the Presidio. It's a spectacular moment of collaboration that we'll explore in more detail in the next episode, and it served as motivation for the bickering interest groups in San Antonio to seek common ground. The Compromise of August 14, 1745, opened up the city council to full participation by any local property owner, Isleño or otherwise. Landowners were required to fence their land, putting to bed the never-ending disputes arising from stray livestock. Isleños and vecinos abandoned their attempts to hire Mission Indians, but trade with the Presidio was opened up, even as it was instructed to retain a preference for certain mission goods. In exchange, the missions made available some of the much-coveted farmland that they'd been holding in reserve on the east bank of the San Antonio River. Compromises always look easy, or even inevitable after the fact, and we shouldn't make of this some great kumbaya moment from which a unified San Antonio identity emerges. On the contrary, what San Antonio was in 1745 was in fact many San Antonios. There was the Villa de Béjar of the old vecinos, the Villa de San Fernando of the new Isleños, the Presidio de Béjar, the College of Querétaro's old Mission Valero, the College of Zacatecas' Mission San Jose, and the relocated East Texas missions of Concepcion, San Juan, and Espada, each relatively self-governing and in many respects self-contained. Indeed, you can still see the indirect legacy of these many San Antonios today in San Antonio's 17-some-odd school districts. Yet this diversity gave early San Antonio its resiliency. When the mission struggled, as in the smallpox epidemic of 1738, the town could still flourish. When immigration stagnated, the Presidio could be reinforced. And when the Presidio was undermanned, the townfolk and even the mission Indians could take up the defense of the settlement. For this and other reasons, San Antonio was starting to look different than other towns in New Spain, and its political institutions took on their own character as well. Indeed, if San Antonio was known for anything during the years of Spanish rule, it was known for its political fractiousness, which was just as often misread as political dysfunctionality. Royal and viceregal authorities didn't know what to make of San Antonians' never-ending political disputes, or of the emergence of democratic institutions. In most other new Spanish frontier towns, a city council position was held for life, and vacancies were filled by appointment or bequeathed to an heir. Yet within 2 decades of the formation of the San Fernando City Council, regidores and alcaldes were rolling off and stepping down, with their successor determined by annual open elections. This was partly an artifact of San Antonio's isolation. Elections were a practical way to fill a vacancy on the frontier, when appointments could be delayed for months by the long distances involved. But they also provided a healthy venue for resolving the various political controversies which consumed San Antonio in its first decades, helping make of politics a game rather than a tool of compulsion by the well-connected. And it played to 2 pronounced traits shared by both the original vecinos and the new Isleños: a fierce independence and a determination to take control of their own destinies. By 1745, San Antonio's success as a settlement made it the model for future Spanish colonization efforts, such as those of José Escandón, which would settle modern-day Tamaulipas, Laredo, and Goliad. It also taught Spanish authorities what not to do. Indeed, before the Isleños had even arrived in San Antonio, the viceroy was scrapping plans to send another 400 Canary Island families because the endeavor was so expensive. And for the future of San Antonio, it was also unnecessary. The natural increase of San Antonio through military retirements, Indian conversions, and intermarriages during the years 1731 and 1745 was far larger than the subsidized migrations of Spaniards from the home country, and frankly, much lower maintenance. By 1745, there were probably more than 1,000 souls milling around the San Antonio Presidio, missions, and town. San Antonio was on the map. In the next episode, we're going to explore the map of early San Antonio and the lives of its inhabitants in the mid-18th century. Thank you for listening. Please go to iTunes or Stitcher and subscribe and leave us a review, because if everyone who listened to this podcast left a review on iTunes or Stitcher, it would launch San Antonio's story to the top of the charts. For more information and old episodes, you can also visit our website at brandonseal.com. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco. Sound engineering was performed by Stephen Bennett. A special thanks to my friend Noel McKay for letting us use his song, Mi San Antonio. For this episode, I've got to thank Professor Jesus de la Teja. Professor de la Teja is one of a handful of Texas historians who in recent years have opened up the early years of San Antonio's settlement, most notably in his work, San Antonio de Beja, a community on New Spain's northern frontier. This was much needed work, and it's hard work. Most of the people we're talking about didn't have time to write about their lives. They were too busy trying to make a living. The historian then has to connect the sparse historical dots and dig through baptismal records and 300-year-old archives spread throughout the world. And Professor de la Teja, the former official state historian of Texas, is one of the best at this. I'd also like to thank KSAT 12 News. Check out their hour-long special on the Canary Islanders and the founding of San Antonio as well, available online. And lastly, for this episode, I recommend that you go to San Fernando Cathedral on Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, or Sunday night and watch the light show. It tells the story of San Antonio from its founding to today, and it tells it at the spot that has borne witness to most of that history. Because if any one place can be said to be the heart of our city, it's San Fernando Cathedral, from whose dome all distances in San Antonio are still measured.